Good evening. Welcome to our Module 3, Global Trade and Political Economy, Economics 330. I am Professor Felix Obi. This is the City University of New York, Medgar Evers College. This week, today, of course, is Tuesday, February 11th, 2025. And this week, we begin a two-part discussion on how global trade is managed among nations, which we will conclude next week with a review of the institutions that have been set up since World War II to manage global trade, their histories, and their different roles. As such, the learning objectives for this module includes the following. 1. Differentiate between different errors in the theory of trade and their underlying themes. To which I will say, the mercantilist period, aka the origins of international political economy, are closely associated with the development of modern European states and their global markets. The modern European states gained official recognition at the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, which marked the defeat of the Catholic Habsburg countries by mostly Protestant countries in Northern Europe. The Treaty of Westphalia upheld state sovereignty and territorial integrity by institutionalizing changes to prevent external religious and secular authorities, example the Pope, Holy Roman Emperor, and other states from interfering in a state's internal affairs. A major factor enabling the state to establish its authority vis-a-vis internal and external forces was the development of mercantilism. Mercantilists were acutely aware of the linkage between politics and economics, viewing both power and wealth as essential goal of national policy. Again, one of the commitments that I made during our first week of class is to try to avoid making the class too abstract by linking the learning objectives with ongoing current events in the country and internationally. As such, we can sort of scan the domestic and global commercial scene and see elements of mercantilism with respect to tariffs, threats of tariffs, and seeing a symbiotic alignment between power and wealth as essential goals of national policy. This is distinct, and we will get into that from a rules-based international trading system. But again, I'm getting ahead of us. The mercantilist states could use their wealth to build up their armed forces, hire mercenaries, and influence their enemies and allies. So here are the keys again. A mercantilist state could use its wealth to build up its armies, armed forces, hire mercenaries, and influence their enemies and allies. I could think of Ukraine, the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as one glaring example of that. Thus, they accumulate gold and silver by seeking trade advantages over others in the following ways. They increase their exports and decrease their imports of manufactured goods. They restrict raw materials and technology exports to prevent others from developing manufacturing capabilities and import raw materials they need to reduce cost of their own manufacturers. Colonialism was central to mercantilism because the colonies provided the metropole, which is the core, or the colonizer, with raw materials and served as market for its manufactured goods. Thus, manufacturing in the colonies was usually prohibited or at least discouraged. Of course, you could quickly see the potential challenge with mercantilism. So if we were to rewind a little bit, right, The mercantilists wanted to increase their exports, decrease their imports of manufactured goods, and restricted raw material and technology exports to prevent others from competing with them. So that sounds fair and reasonable on its face. The problem, though, is that for that country to continue to export, there has to be effective demand from other countries. And hopefully we will all remember from basic economics that effective demand is a demand that is backed by the capacity to actually purchase the goods and or service. So trade has to be, all trading partners have to prosper as a consequence of engaging in global trade. And therefore, they can continue to be effective demand within the global trading system. And that is the shortcoming, one of the major shortcomings of mercantilism. So the next step is the Industrial Revolution and British hegemony. Mercantilism, as the term is used in the class textbook, is a pre-industrial doctrine. The Industrial Revolution, which began in about 1780, affected only some manufacturers and means of production, and initially progressed from region to region rather than involving entire countries. However, Britain became the hegemonic power in the 19th century as it was the first state to industrialize. By 1860, Britain accounted for 37% of European industrial production, 20% of world industrial production, and 80% of newer technology industries. Britain shifted from mercantilist policies towards free trade. It removed most of its industrial trade restrictions by the 1830s, and in 1846, it repealed the Corn Laws, which had restricted agricultural imports. The decline of British hegemony and World War I. The growth of trade became slower in the late 19th century because of depressed economic conditions, industrial protectionism on the European continent, and a decline of British hegemony. A decrease in British productivity relative to the United States and Germany made it less competitive in trade and less able to serve as a market for other countries' exports. Realize what I said, that all countries have to, on balance, prosper from engaging in international trade. That way they can be a market, potentially be a market for your exports. The second learning objective is to identify and explain the underlying philosophies of different theories of international trade. Theories of international trade tend to explain the nature and movement of international trade. Such theories can also be classified into classical country-based theories, mercantilism, absolute advantage, comparative advantage, and the Heckscher-Ohlin theory. These are critical phrases and terms that I think is helpful that you take your time to write it down, memorize it, and please adapt it into your logic. And as you discuss global trade and political economy, they convey a technical knowledge of the subject matter, and they also help you make a more succinct and focused argument as you begin to think through your positions on global trade and political economy. So mercantilism, second is absolute advantage, the third is comparative advantage, and the fourth is a Heckscher-Ohlin theory. So let's unpack these. Theory of mercantilism. This trade theory prevailed during the 16th to 19th centuries, where the wealth of a nation is measured based on its accumulated wealth in terms of gold and silver. It calls on nations to accumulate wealth by encouraging exports and discouraging imports. Theory of mercantilism aims to create trade surplus, which in turn accumulates the nation's wealth. Again, as I mentioned, the downside to this is that eventually you're going to need wealthy customers who could actually afford to buy the goods and services that you manufacture. So that is, again, an encapsulation of mercantilism. The next is absolute advantage theory, which has origin in Adam Smith's An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. It's a seminal economics book that was published in 1776 by Adam Smith. So the theory is fairly straightforward. When a country can produce a unit of good with less cost, i.e. cheaper and or faster than another country, the first country has an absolute cost advantage in producing that good. So here we go again. When a country can produce a unit of good with less cost, i.e. cheaper and or faster than another country, the first country is said to have an absolute cost advantage in producing that good. The third is comparative advantage. If you remember, the first phrase is a theory of mercantilism. The second is absolute advantage. The third is comparative advantage theory. And it has origin in David Ricardo's The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, which was published in 1817. And the theory is fairly straightforward again. And it says, nations can still gain from trade, even without an absolute advantage. Remember, an absolute advantage is when a country can produce a unit of good or with less cost, i.e. cheaper and or faster than another country. The first country in this equation has an absolute advantage, an absolute cost advantage in producing their goods. But David Ricardo extends that thought by suggesting that even when a nation does not have an absolute advantage in producing a good, it can still gain from international trade. For instance, a country has comparative, not absolute, comparative advantage in producing a good if the opportunity cost of producing that good is in terms of the other goods is lower in that country compared to other countries. Comparative advantages focuses on the relative productivity differences, whereas absolute advantage looks at the absolute productivity. Now there is the endowment theory, or the Heckscher-Ohlin model, factor proportions theory. According to this theory, a nation will export the commodity whose production requires intensive use of the nation's relatively abundant and cheap factors, and import the commodity whose production requires intensive use of the nation's scarce and expensive factors. Thus, a country with an abundance of cheap labor would export labor-intensive products and import capital-intensive goods and services, and vice versa. On the other hand, modern firm-based theories include country similarity, product life cycle, global strategic rivalry, and Porter's national competitive advantage. Again, let's unpack these. Product life cycle theory. It states that international markets tend to follow a cyclical pattern due to a variety of factors over a period of time, which explains the shifting of markets as well as the location of production. Of note, the level of innovation and technology, resources, size of the market, and competitive structures influence trade patterns. In addition, the gap in technology and preference and the ability of the customers in international markets also determine the stage of international product life cycles. or IPLC. The theory of competitive advantage of international trade. Now remember, it's absolute advantage, comparative advantage. Now this is competitive advantage. As propounded by Michael Porter in The Competitive Advantage of Nations, the theory of competitive advantage concentrates on a firm's home country environment as the main source of competencies and innovation. So again, competitive advantage concentrates on a firm's or a multinational's home country environment as the main source of competencies and innovation. The model is often referred to as the diamond model, wherein four determinants interact with each other, and these include factor conditions, demand conditions, related and supporting industries, firm strategy, structure, and rivalry. Number 3, identify the trend of the development in international economic relations up to World War III and beyond. Okay, so what are the trends since World War II? The interwar period. The United States emerged from World War II. The interwar, of course, is the period between World War I and World War II. The United States emerged from World War I as the world's largest industrial power and the only major net creditor. Although the United States lent about $10 billion to cash-short countries during the 1920s, some U.S. policies did not facilitate a return to an open, liberal economy. For example, the United States initially insisted that its close allies, Britain and France, repay all their war debts. And it imposed import barriers that made it difficult for Europeans to gain revenue from exports. So think about the conundrum that our policy presented even to us, forget our allies. After World War I, our major allies, Britain and France, were in poor economic shape. They needed infrastructure that needed to be rebuilt. That in and of itself would also cost money. So we loaned them money, up to $10 billion, but insisted that they pay all of it back. They repay them, which is fair. Except we also impose import barriers. So how would the countries make money to repay us if they're unable to sell their goods and services to us, the largest market? Because the United States emerged as the largest market, largest economy post-World War I. So that's a conundrum. And by the way, we were not going to be able to sell much to them either, because if their economy is not doing well, they will not have that much effective demand capacity. The capacity to consume will be limited, which in the long run would also compromise our ability to export and grow our economy. The 1922 Fordney-Macomber Act raised U.S. custom duties. And when the U.S. economy moved into depression, of course, because we're not buying competitively priced goods through international trade, and we are unable to maximize our exports because our trading partners are not, the economies are doing badly, so they're unable to consume in a manner that will allow us the benefit of a robust export market. So the 1922 Fordney-Macomber Act compounded the issues because it raised U.S. custom duties. And when the U.S. economy moved into depression from the 1929 stock market crash, the 1930 Smoot-Hawley Act increased U.S. tariffs to their highest levels in the 20th century. This in hindsight, obviously, and I'm sure there are some economists that also thought that was not the brightest idea. But at least in hindsight, we can all agree, hopefully, that the Smoot-Hawley Act was counterintuitive. So as a consequence, European states retaliated with their own import restrictions. And the world trade declined from 35 billion in 1929 to 12 billion in 1933. This is a critical lesson for this point in time because it just seems like in 2025, history may just repeat itself where we slap sanctions on some of our largest trading partners. And of course, they will slap retaliatory sanctions on us. And as I hope we all understand now in basic economics, that sanctions actually has an inflationary pressure. So when we slap sanctions, the cost of everything goes up, and typically the cost of what's sanctioned especially would go up, and among other complementary goods, and typically the manufacturers will pass on the price to the consumer. Even worse, if we try to manufacture those goods locally, that would mean that we're trying to manufacture goods that we don't have a natural comparative advantage in manufacturing. That means we're not manufacturing, we're not allocating we're most likely not allocating our capital efficiently and our productive capacity efficiently. Hegemonic stability theorists argue that the lack of global hegemony prevented the development of an open, stable international economy in the interwar period. This is critical, at least even if you were to take global trade from a global hegemonic stability theory perspective. It suggests that there has to be a global hegemon to prevent, that would help stabilize and discourage any barriers to an open, stable international economy. This is a role I would argue that the world may just need at this point. To be clear, many countries, and I'm thinking perhaps China, have been accused of engaging in uneconomic trade practices. And that clearly runs counter to a rules-based international trading system. And that obviously has to be discouraged. But writ large, the idea of tariffs as a foreign policy tool, I guess it's going to leave a lot to be studied and a lot to be monitored through in the months and years ahead. So the institutional framework before World War II. Most international organizations, or IOs, from 1815 to 1914 were designed to utilize technological innovations and promote economic regulation and commerce, mainly among European states. The first IO, the Bank for International Settlement, or BIS, was established in Basel, Switzerland in 1930 to oversee the settlement of the German reparations after World War I. But its main purpose was to promote cooperation among central banks. Other than the BIS, economic IOs in the interwar period were mainly concerned with developing international standards for facilities, equipment, and installations required for the functioning of the global economy. These organizations were not able to deal with major economic problems such as the Great Depression. 4, you should also be able to explain the differences in the functions and rules of post-World War II institutions developed to manage trade relations, right? And with respect to that, consider that in July 1944, delegates from 44 countries convened in Bretton Woods Conference, and within Bretton Woods, this being, of course, in New England here in the United States, in East Coast. So in July 1944, delegates from 44 countries convened in Bretton Woods Conference. And within 22 days, they endorsed a framework for international economic cooperation after World War II. Two international economic organizations resulted from the Bretton Woods Conference. Bretton Woods is in New Hampshire again, as I said. First, the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. Now, we're going to have a lot of conversation about the work, the benefits, and some of the challenges and allegations against the IMF. We're going to have those discussions in the weeks ahead. The IMF is regarded as the global lender of last resort to national governments and a leading supporter of exchange rate stability. Its stated mission is working to foster global monetary cooperation, secure financial stability, facilitate international trade, promote high employment and sustainable economic growth, and reduce poverty around the world. So again, IMF is regarded as the global lender of last resort. What that simply means is that when a country has faced such economic challenges that it can no longer, for instance, go to the bond market, it no longer has the credibility to put out bonds, no longer has the credibility to go to private lenders, and it can no longer afford its exports, and it needs money to restructure. And there is no place else to go turn to. They go to the IMF. Suffice it to say that by the time a country is knocking on IMF's door, there are deep structural problems that had nothing to do with the IMF. But again, this is a conversation we're going to unpack in more detail in the weeks ahead. So the stated mission of the IMF is working to foster global monetary cooperation, secure financial stability, facilitate international trade, promote high employment and sustainable economic growth, and reduce poverty around the world. The IMF began with an original goal of reconstructing the international monetary system after World War II. It now plays a central role in the management of balance of payments difficulties and international financial crisis. So very, very, very quickly, balance of payment difficulties simply means, for instance, countries are really a macro version of what we do as individuals or as families. We get a paycheck, that is a country exporting, gets money when it exports. Then the country imports. It spends money to import. So export is like a paycheck for the country. It gets money. Import is consumption. It's like us going to the supermarket and you go consume. What happens if our weekly grocery bill exceeds our net income? Or just our weekly bills, our weekly obligations exceed our weekly income. Let's say all obligations, rent, electricity, heat, grocery, health insurance, every week comes out to $100. But our income weekly is $80. So if a country's export is $80, it can only make $80 a week from export. Of course, they don't judge this in weekly. But the imports that it needs to survive, it needs to import gasoline. It needs to import food items and then medical supplies. And the imports is $100. That means there's a $20 shortfall, right? So this is a major problem. So this is what's called a balance of payment deterioration. So what the World Bank would do is help a country access the balance of the $20 that it needs to, and this is putting it in the simplest terms. The IMF would come in and help the country access the $20 that it needs to balance its payments. However, that cannot continue, obviously. You can see how that's not sustainable, because if the IMF were to help the country access the $20 this week, what about next week, and the week after that, and the week after that? So the IMF would ask for reforms. And this is where the controversy about the IMF comes in, which is not different from families. If you're making $80 a month and your overhead is $100 a month, you're going to have to cut something somewhere. Or you're going to have to also get a second job or a third job, whatever it means. But that's an imbalance that is unsustainable. And it's no different from countries, of course, on a macro and much more complex level. So IMF began with an original goal of reconstructing the international monetary system after World War II. It now plays a central role in the management of balance of payment difficulties and international financial crisis. Through a quota system, countries contribute funds to a pool from which countries can borrow if they experience balance of payment problems. Of course, I don't want to gloss over the financial crisis part, and we're going to go into this in some detail in the weeks ahead. And we can very quickly highlight the financial crisis that the Eurozone went through when the Economist magazine coined the phrase pegs, that they thought Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain were dragging down the European Union and creating an imbalance that was undermining the euro as a currency. But again, this is a conversation and a topic we're going to drill down on in the weeks ahead. So the second international organization that came out of the Bretton Woods Institution is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, which is now part of the World Bank Group. So I'm sure most, if not all of us, have heard about, actually I do hope that we have all heard of the World Bank. It's instructive to note, though, that the World Bank isn't a bank. It's actually a conglomerate of different banks. And it started as the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, which now is one of the constituent banks of the World Bank Group. Don't forget the group in the name. So the World Bank Group is an international financial institution that provides loans and grants to government and private institutions of low and middle income countries for the purpose of pursuing capital projects. Its vision is to create a world free of poverty on a livable planet. That's a very ambitious and critical goal, to create a world free of poverty and a livable planet. The World Bank Group is a unique global partnership of 5 institutions working for sustainable solutions that reduce poverty and build shared prosperity in developing countries. And these 5 institutions include IBRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. 2, the second one is IDA, the International Development Association. The third is IFC, International Finance Corporation. The fourth is MIGA, M-I-G-A, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. And the fifth is ICSID, the International Center for Settlement for Investment Disputes. Partnering with governments. The IBRD, or the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and IDA, which is the International Development Association, 2 of the 5 constituent banks of the World Bank groups, form the World Bank institutions that provide financing, policy advice, and technical assistance to governments of developing countries. IDA focuses on the world's poorest countries, while IBRD assists middle-income and credit-worthy poorer countries. Partnering with the private sector. IFC, MIGA, and ICSID focus on strengthening the private sector of developing countries. So one is public, and the public sectors are critical because they create an enabling environment for the private sectors to be able to flourish and thrive. However, 3 of the constituent banks of the World Bank also focuses on helping the private sector build their capacity to be able to take advantage of that enabling environment that hopefully that government would have created or enabled. So the IFC, MIGA, and ICSID focus on strengthening the private sector in developing countries. Through these institutions, the World Bank Group provides financing, technical assistance, political risk insurance, and settlement of disputes to private enterprises, including financial institutions. Then another post-World War II international institution came about in 1948 with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, otherwise known as GATT. GATT became the main global trade organization. GATT was set up, that is GATT. GATT was set up to eliminate protectionism, i.e. no tariffs, get countries trading freely among themselves, and help restore economic prosperity following the devastation of World War II. Accordingly, GATT was created to form rules to end or restrict the most costly and undesirable features of the pre-war protectionist period, namely quantitative trade barriers such as trade controls and quotas. GATT also provided a system to arbitrate commercial disputes among nations, and the framework enabled a number of multilateral negotiations for the reduction of tariff barriers. In 1995, the GATT was superseded by the World Trade Organization, or WTO. GATT, though largely successful in its goal, lacked a coherent institutional structure. In short, GATT was a legal agreement acting as an international organization. The World Trade Organization incorporates the principles of the GATT and is better positioned to carry them out because, among other things, it is better versed in issues like intellectual property, has faster dispute settlement system, and wields more power. Significantly, the World Trade Organization rules are applicable to services and aspects of intellectual property, along with the goods that was obviously a linchpin of GATT. The next critical institution, post-World War II institution, and these institutions are the institutions that are the foundation of a rules-based international system or rules-based international order. The other institution is the United Nations, which succeeded the League of Nations and was established after World War II. And this charter, which was drafted by 50 countries in San Francisco, California, took effect on 24th October 1945. With the aim of preventing future world wars, the UN is an intergovernmental organization whose stated purpose are to maintain international peace and security, develop friendly relations among nations, achieve international cooperation, and serve as a center for harmonizing the actions of nations. It is the world's largest international organization. So, again, here are some of those key words and phrases. Balance of payment, BOP, also known as the balance of international payments. Touched on this, it is a statement of all transactions made between entities in one country and the rest of the world over a defined period, such as a quarter or a year. The two main components of a balance of payment are current account and capital account. Understand that a balance of payment is how countries know if it's living within its means or if it needs structural reform and short-term assistance from the IMF. As I mentioned previously, balance of payment is the net receipts that a country gets from its exports and the net cost of its imports. It's always helpful that you make more than you spend. And when you don't, then you're running a trade deficit, which would lead to a budget deficit, which would lead to economic challenges. So first, current account. Again, as I said, there are two main components of balance of payment, a current account and a capital account. A current account, a country's current account records the value of exports and imports from both goods and services. Second, a capital account is a country's capital account tracks the net balance of international investments. In other words, it keeps track of the flow of money between a nation and its foreign partners. So, as I wind down this week's class, which I think is really, we're beginning to cook here. So as we wind down this lecture, I'd like to remind the class that next week, I think next week, Monday, is a holiday, and then class, I think, starts on Tuesday. I believe so. So if you don't see an announcement by Sunday night, as I usually send out, don't freak out. I believe, and I'm going to confirm this, that Monday is a holiday and the school week actually starts on Tuesday. So just to bear that in mind. With that, let me foreshadow next week's lecture by confirming that Module 4 will be on the major institutions for managing world trade. So this concludes the formal lecture portion of this week's office hour and lecture. And with that, I am going to stop the recording. Let's see.